So I'm not going to give this man a long introduction because if you've heard of him, you already know everything you need to know. And if you haven't heard of him, you need to. So Tim Urban has been writing stick figure illustrated posts on his blog, Wait But Why, all the way since 2013. And this is his first book, but he is going to write many more. And I can guarantee you the way that he makes sense of things, people are going to be clamoring for it. He is Tim Urban. It's such a pleasure to see you, Tim, and well done on this book. It's tremendous.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me on.
So I don't even know where to begin except to tell you that normally when I have to review books, and there are a lot of those that come along, and most of them are fascinating, but really I skim through and I'll look at one or two pages, then skip a few, go to the next one. And I was going to do that with your book, but I found myself absolutely engrossed, perhaps because I'm sick of having arguments with my friends, the people who are ideologically not my friends, people in broad society, people on my show. I'm sick of having discussions about stuff where we end up in a stalemate because nobody really knows what the defining principles are, and no one can really define the problems that we have. And your book has gone a long way to helping me figure out much of that. And I have to say, it was an absolute pleasure going through it from the very beginning until the very end. And I just love the book. Here it is so that people know right up front. It's called What's Our Problem? A Self-Help Book for Societies, Tim Urban. So listen, first of all, well done. Where did the idea come from to do this? Were you also frustrated with getting stuck?
Yes. And as a writer, I'm a blogger, right? I'm on my own platform. Right. I can write about whatever I want. But I noticed like two concurrent trends. One was that the society I lived in seemed to be, you can almost say like society has kind of is like if it's a giant organism. People grow up as they age, but societies don't really. They grow more mature and wise, and then they kind of digress and they go back down to times of I don't know. There's mobs, there's witch hunts, there's tribalism is on the rise, and
even a casual reading of history will show you that not every society survives, and the ones that do ultimately have a call time as well.
It's actually really most of the great civilizations have not survived, and it's technology seems to go up, but wisdom is cyclical. It's we start acting like witch burners in 2020. But it's like, that was like from the 1600s. Why are we doing that right now? Or you look at like Nazi Germany and you're like, how could that happen? And it's like, these are the same people. They're not different than us. They're not worse than us. It's just that humans have the capacity to kind of in groups, kind of ascend and descend this like, and this cycle of wisdom. So I'm noticing on one hand, it seems like we're on one of these down slopes. And at a time when technology is like it tends to, but really exploding. So it's a time when like we want to have our wits about us. And so that's going on. Now, meanwhile, I'm a writer and I can write about anything, except I don't want to write about this because there is all this external pressure I feel to stay away from it. And friends would tell me, why would you ever get wade into that stuff? Don't,
right.
You have haters right now. Why would you do that? Right. And I'm thinking, so it's not just me. If I'm feeling that, it's not just me. It means that all kinds of voices. I'm an independent voice, an independent platform. If I worked for a company or if I was reliant on, using a middleman company to publish my stuff or whatever, it would be even worse. So I'm thinking this must be going on throughout society. So we have this giant problem going on, this trend going in the wrong direction. And there's all this pressure to not talk about it, to not talk honestly about it, to keep it to private conversations because you don't want to be in the line of fire. And I'm like, okay, so those things together, I was like, I'm going to write about this. And it was supposed to be a blog post and it turned into a much longer thing, a book. But because there was so much to say, as it turns out, this topic is not a small topic. But yeah, that's what got me into it.
I mean, I'm just going to use a quote from the beginning of your book here. You said humans, and you've kind of paraphrased some of this, so I'm not going to dwell on it too much. People can read the book themselves. But you say here humans are supposed to mature as they age, but the giant human that we live in has got more childish every year. Tribalism, political division are on the rise. I don't think anyone will disagree about that. False narratives, outlandish conspiracy theories are flourishing, especially post COVID. Major institutions are floundering. Medieval style public shaming is back. Trust, the critical currency of a healthy society, is disintegrating. And these trends seem to be happening in lots of societies, not just yours. So, what's the problem? Why, in a time so prosperous with the stakes so high, would we be going backward in wisdom? And you warn at the beginning of this, and I think you put a lot of things into perspective. Again, we tend to get so engrossed in our confirmation bias and many other things that we forget about the context of the time we're living in. Some of the most atrocious things humans have ever done to humans happened in the last 100 years. And in historical, in planetary, even in human species time, that's an absolute blip on the radar. We should have been getting to a point where we're more civilized, and those kinds of things are a thing of the past. And what you warn, I think, either because it's a really, really good way to get people to pour themselves into the book, or it's because it's bloody terrifying and it's true, is that if we go wrong now with all this technological capability, with the connectedness that we've never had before, it could be the most dire mistake we make, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of this worrying concept, which is that technology makes good times better and bad times worse. More technology means kind of, better good times, worse bad times. So the perfect easy example is the 20th century. It was the best century ever on so many metrics: GDP per capita, life expectancy, general, medicine and health, and the curing of diseases, and poverty, the amount of people in extreme poverty, women's rights. I mean, there's so many examples, democracy, around the world, of like this was clearly the best century ever. Also, the same century had the biggest, most catastrophic wars in human history, had the biggest genocides ever, had and introduced existential risk, like species wide, like we might go extinct if something goes wrong. Risk for the first time ever. No other century can say that if something happens, if the wrong leader makes the wrong move, the entire species might go. That's never been possible. Suddenly we have nukes. Then we have stuff like climate change. These like big, because technology means we have so much power as a species. It's like we're getting, it's almost like we're just like our footprint's getting bigger. We're stomping around. We're getting more and more powerful, and we're getting these magic wands that can do these incredible things. And it's like at some point, those things it becomes kind of very precarious. Those same magic wands in general that kind of give us all this prosperity can totally wipe us out. And so then I turned to our future. So we can see all these paradigm shifts happening across different industries. Where technology is exploding in so many different areas, and groundbreaking developments in genetic engineering and nanotechnology and artificial intelligence and multiplanetary, colonization, in brain machine interfaces, these, in
Neuralink,
like, yeah, exactly. Neuralink, things like CRISPR, that the ability to, and then you involve AI with that, and what can it do? This is incredible, but also like now you can have bioweapons are way easier to create, and nuclear, we thought we were kind of done with like thinking about nuke as a threat, and now it's like, well, we're all kind of thinking about it again. AI obviously is kind of the ultimate example of something that can do wonders for us, and also like could totally wipe us out. So that it was just like, we have to be smart right now. We have to be as wise as we can. And yeah, we seem to be doing the opposite.
So this is where you break things down really well. And I've also got to just advise anybody who's, trepidatious about this, because they look at these subjects and they go, oh God, no, I don't want to bite off that massive elephant. It's going to take me a long time to digest this. But what you do, and you've done it on your blog for years, is you You help people understand, and I don't mean this in any patronizing way, because I think of myself as moderately intelligent, and I didn't find any of this like childish or an idiot's guide type style. I love the way that you are able to in pictures sometimes tell a better story than in words. You include lots of these in here. I mean, for example, here's conviction and knowledge, which is again something that makes such sense when you break it down this way. Where arrogance comes from, insecurity, and then how you want to be, especially if you think like a scientist, which is one of the things that you talk about in your book, in this humility sweet spot. And then you kind of detail what happens if you don't, if you go into the other zones, what kind of thinking you do. Essentially, and I don't want to simplify too much here, because I do again think it would be valuable for everybody who's interested in having meaningful conversations and in safeguarding themselves from mind viruses, groupthink, terrible behavior, bad ideas, zealotry, all of that stuff, for them to actually read this themselves. But essentially, you break down a vertical how we think as opposed to just what we think, the usual horizontal line on that graph, which is politics, left and right and all the traditional stuff. I love this because it's it's been bubbling around in most of our heads. We're not sure how to define it, and you make it crystal clear. You explain it pretty simply, and it feels like at the end of it, you've got a grip on what people are doing and how they're thinking.
Yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of stuff that we think about that we don't necessarily have a language for. And when you don't have a language for something or terms to describe things, it kind of is hard to talk about. And it's hard to, maybe labels are just very helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we should have endless labels for what we think. Not just, are you on the left or the right politically, but are you a libertarian, or are you a socialist, or it's like there's economics. There's all kinds of schools of thought, right? And we're so great at kind of categorizing the different ways, the different things we might think, the different opinions, and then labeling them, and then putting them on axes, and then pitting them against each other, and whatever it is. And that's great. Like, I think it's good that we have all those labels. It's helps to have nuanced understanding of what the different areas of thought are. But then we get to how we think. And it's like, if someone comes up to me on the street and they're like, you should take this pill, probably going to say no, because I'm like, I don't have any, you don't know, like okay, that conviction that you seem to have, is it based on knowledge? Who are you? What's your background? How do you know what I need? It's going to be all kinds of reasons I'm going to say no. If I go to the doctor and they do a bunch of measurements and take blood, and then they say, we think you should take this pill, I'll probably take the pill. And what I'm doing implicitly there is I'm putting them on a how you think axis. So they're both saying the same what you think. They have the same opinion. But the doctor I'm going to put high up on the how you think axis, and that rando on the street, it's a question mark. Maybe they're high up, maybe they're low down, but I don't know. So I'm certainly not going to trust them. Now, that's obvious. That's an obvious example. But when someone has a strong political opinion, they have a strong opinion about something to do with any kind of raging political issue, we're so much more likely to judge based on what they're saying. If they agree with us, we think they're a good thinker. If they disagree with us, we think they must be a bad thinker. And that's kind of making the how you think axis also the what you think axis. And that's not true. The how you think axis should be a vertical thing.
Yeah. You also detail how it can go further than that they think like a bad person, but that eventually if you are a zealot at the bottom, you think that they are a bad person, full stop. And we tend to make these value assessments, and some of them are very good if you go up to the scientist, and some of them, if you go down to the zealot, are very bad. But what I also love about this is that you caution, a lot of smart people, again in inverted commas, smart people. You say here, In case you're thinking I'm a really smart person, so I'm safe from this low kind of thinking, the low rungs, Adam Grant has bad news for you. This is in the footnotes to show you how much I actually read of this book. Research reveals that the higher you score in an IQ test, I thought this was fascinating, the more likely you are to fall for stereotypes because you're faster at recognizing patterns. Now, I mean, that is so obvious when you read it, but nobody thinks that. People think, oh, well, I'm smart, I can pick up patterns, but they don't realize that those patterns are also helping them to establish and even to strengthen the idea of stereotypes in their head, no matter how unbigoted, as an unwieldy term, they think they are, right?
Yeah, I mean, I like to think of it as like everyone has a little lawyer in their head whose goal is not to find the truth, but to confirm, confirmation bias, to
Mhm.
strengthen your current beliefs, to feel right. So and that lawyer, really smart people have a really smart lawyer
Good
in their
lawyer.
head who builds a really compelling case.
Right.
And so they talk themselves into their own bullshit very easily, and they can be the most delusional of all, because they feel like they have backing for all of this, and there's another character in our heads, the scientist, and this simplifies kind of it's like a kind of a distilled version of this how you think axis, but basically when the scientist in your head, now this scientist, what they just use the scientific method, right? The goal is to have hypotheses, being humble about them.
Approach things humbly, yeah, right.
Yeah, collect all kinds of info.
And then test the hell out of it.
Yeah, and don't be rooting for anything to be right. Don't be attached to any one conclusion. Say, I'm just going to collect info. I'm going to assess it and assess where this info came from. Who are the voices? How trustworthy are they? How much do I know about them? And then I'm going to come up with a hypothesis after I do that for a while. And then I'm going to go test it. I'm going to go argue it. I'm going to go find things that disagree with it and see how it stands up. And if it doesn't stand up, I'm not going to be upset. I'm going to happily change my mind because I just got new information. And now I'm going to eventually get to a really good hypothesis that stands up to testing, and I can kind of elevate it to knowledge and status of it into knowledge in my head. And now I can, now I know something. And now if we always thought like that, we'd be very, first of all, we'd say, I don't know all the time. We'd be very humble.
Right.
And we would be totally down to change our minds. And what we would end up with is we'd be incredibly knowledgeable, real knowledge. We'd have so much real knowledge, and we'd be, we'd just be such great thinkers. But of course, there's this other character. There's the attorney who has a totally different viewpoint, who says, who's attached to the ideas, who feels like the ideas are part of who we are. And so if the idea is wrong, it means I must be stupid or wrong or bad, or that people like me, all of my friends, we all agree with this. I have to be like one of us. And so for all these weird human reasons, we get very attached, we identify with our ideas, and that's the attorney's job is to protect those sacred ideas. And so it's kind of a tug of war between these two ways of thinking. And I think that we all have them going on. But when the scientist is winning out more, when we've learned to notice the attorney and say, no, stop doing that, and really, go through the pain of changing our minds and know that it's the right thing, then I think we're a high rung thinker. We're up on the high rungs of this like ladder, which is kind of the how you think axis. I make it a ladder. And then
also, it's fair to say you divided it into four, and we've mentioned three of them already. There's the scientist, there's the attorney, which you mentioned, there's the zealot, but we've left out the sports fan. Do you just want to explain that way of thinking too? Because I think to give people an idea, a lot of people understand what a sports fan is, but in terms of thinking.
Right. So I simplified it to just like high rung scientist and low rung attorney, but really there's two high rungs and two lower rungs. So it's like you have the scientist at the very top. That's the thinking that I described, is when you're just totally, you're the boss of your ideas. Your ideas can't tell you what to do. If you disagree, if you learn one of the ideas is wrong, kick it out, eject it, right? It's gone. And the sports fan is the second rung. And what I mean by that is like as a sports fan, I will always think that my team got the wrong call. And, I have this weird bias. Mm-hmm. But when the replay shows what really happened, I'm happy that it's the accurate call. I want the call to be accurate, even if it goes against my team. I don't want corrupt refs. I want my team to win fair and square, but I'm rooting really hard for a certain outcome. So when we think like that, we have confirmation bias. We definitely are attached to our ideas. We're rooting for them. We're maybe not so, neutral in our thinking. But when push comes to shove, if someone presents me really good evidence, I will say, you know what? I guess I was wrong. It's a bummer, but I'll change my mind. So the scientist is just all about changing their mind. The sports fan is reluctant, but they will. Now, once you pass the midpoint, that kind of low rung thinking is now the name of the game. So the attorney, doesn't matter what evidence you present to the attorney when you're thinking like an attorney. It doesn't matter how good the evidence is. There's nothing you can say that will make them say, I guess I'm wrong. But they actually know a lot. They have a lot of information. They have all these these arguments for why they're right. And they've done a lot of research. They've just cherry picked the research they want to read, but they know a lot. If you get to the very bottom, you have the zealot, and that's just like the extreme version of, it's the opposite of the scientist. It's someone who not only will they never ever change their mind, but they don't even think they need to research. They don't even think they need any knowledge because obviously it's right. It's like the sky is blue. They're so deep in this like false conviction that they don't even think that they need to put up an argument. They don't debate people. They say they think debates are offensive, and they'll say, and they think that anyone who disagrees with me, it's not that they're wrong or misguided. That it's like you said, they're evil. They must be those people. It becomes extremely tribal. And so I said at the top, what's interesting is that, those people at the bottom, they think they're such great thinkers, have so much conviction, but really what's happening is the scientist, remember, is the boss of their ideas. They're actually the boss in their own head. When you get to the bottom, you are not the boss in your own head. Those ideas are your boss. You are a disciple, a faithful disciple of those ideas, and you'll completely destroy your own ability to collect knowledge. You'll end friendships over it in order to serve those ideas. Like you're a zealot. You're like worshiping those ideas. So that's it. What's an interesting way to think about it is, is that you've lost your own ability to think independently.
I love the breakdown. You also say that one of the greatest things about being in a human civilization is that you can have like a mind meld. People can get together. Those connections produce even better ideas when they're in the scientist or even in the sports fan mode. They can create something called genies, conglomerations of many people thinking in the same way. And then if they're in the lower rungs and they are working together, it can form what you call golems. And I think, that's something which you continue the theme of both of those through the book to great effect, because you can see these things. You don't need a lot of imagination to know that we're creating these superstructures of thinking in society today. And that, if they're the genies, they create amazing ideas labs where people are constantly coming up with novel thoughts, concepts, innovations. And then if they're the golems, they're creating essentially these really destructive power plays and these forceful and coercive, very ugly forces in society.
Yeah, it's like humans can, one of the magic of things about humans that doesn't apply to a lot of other kind of intelligent animals is that we can do mass cooperation the way ants and bees do mass cooperation. And we do it through kind of shared values or shared ideas. And this is one of the reasons we can build this giant civilization, that we all live in. But this kind of part of the interesting thing about this ladder, the high rung kind of mindset and the low rung mindset, is that it produces two totally different kinds of mass collaboration. And so, yeah, it's like at the genie you mentioned, like that's just the name I gave for when high rung thinking is kind of the name of the game. And this can be a small group. It can be 2 or 3 people, 4 or 5, a little startup company. It can be a classroom. It can be a bigger group. It can be a whole country. Each one of these in a way is doing a version of this. And when the name of the game is high rung thinking, it means, as that applies to the group, it means that humility is valued. When you say, I don't know, it makes you seem smart and trustworthy. When you disagreement is fun and is interesting and is totally okay. No one takes it personally. Changing your mind is cool and expected. And a group of friends it doesn't have to all agree. It's totally cool for everyone to disagree. In fact, it's more interesting. It's kind of boring when everyone agrees. And that's just better for the people in it. You become smarter. It's more, you can be yourself. You don't have to be scared to say the wrong thing. But also it has this emergent property where the group itself will end up being smarter than the sum of its parts. This is the history of kind of science institutions, right? You people all over the world, doesn't matter who you are, what language you speak, how old or young you are, whether you lived 100 years ago or today, your hypotheses and your experimentation can add into the great scientific, process that is worldwide. And you can Einstein, living hundreds of years after Newton, can work to disprove Newton's theories. And that's this culture of disagreement. It's cool to say, here's a paper on why that paper is wrong. That's great. And there's peer review. So anyway, that's an example of and look at all the knowledge we've gained. We now know about the Big Bang because, instead of thinking the earth is flat, we go from thinking the earth is flat to understanding the cosmos through this process. That's smarter than any individual human. No human knows how to do that. Or no human can build a skyscraper or an iPhone, but together we can. Now, the other side, when low-rung thinking takes over, a whole different part of our brain wakes up. And it's this part that is we identify with our individual ideas, but as a group, the group is centered around. We all agree on these ideas. That's who we are. We are these people. And these people are the people that agree with them. That bad group, they disagree with this. So if you change your mind, you're not just wrong. You're part of the bad group. You're not in our group anymore. We hate you now. So obviously there's so much pressure to conform. That is a culture. And this can be this can be the smallest group, a married couple, where one member knows you just don't bring up politics and don't disagree with my spouse about politics, because it's not, that is being an echo chamber is being imposed on the couple. It's like, but we all better agree on this. And that can, of course, be a huge group as well. It can be a whole political culture, a whole movement, where it's like, if you're in this movement, no scientist behavior. You better say we are right about everything, and they're the bad guys, and we are, solidarity. So once we're in that zone, we make a very different kind of giant, an emergent giant, and it's I call it the golem, because it's like this big, dumb, tramping, powerful, scary, but stupid, so stupid, Godzilla type thing. And that's a great way to, if you want to overthrow the government, form a big golem. Maybe you can do it. If you want to defeat the other country in war, create a golem. No one's, conformity and soldiers. We are all here. We're under the same flag, and we have the same mission, and we're following the same orders. So it's a great way to use brute force to murder and overpower. And sometimes that's necessary. If you have a horrible, evil dictatorship, maybe that's how you. But in a liberal democracy like ours, it's really out of place, and it's not good for anyone.
So let me move just swiftly onto one. You put a whole lot of really interesting facts in here, which I think help, and you do help to define terms as well. The way people argue has become, I think it's been dumbed down as well. Like, for example, you talk about confirmation bias, you talk about the Martin-Bailey way of arguing, you talk about various terms which people, straw manning, which people who think they're smart throw into arguments, but they don't even necessarily understand the definitions of these things. And it helps to be equipped, first of all, if you just want to have meaningful conversations with the definition, but also if you actually want to make a valid point without falling into the traps that so many people fall into when they start talking about things like politics. You talk about amazingly, and I mean, this is just one of the things I'm going to quote. This is how people are randomly associated in a geographical region. And then as they become more politically polarized, depending on the percentage of that polarization, shows you how it polarizes their actual geographical location. I mean, here's a 20% bias percentage that you detail. So this is when, and correct me where I'm wrong here, but this is when people have about a 20% likelihood of being biased politically against.
Well, no. It specifically here, this definition is, it's if there's blue squares and yellow triangles living in a neighborhood, whatever,
people around you.
And if everyone says, I like diversity, I'm fine to be around. If I'm a blue square, I'm fine to be, neighbors with a bunch of yellow triangles. I just want at least 20% of my immediate touching neighbors to be like me. So if two, out of the 7 or 1 out of the 5 is a blue square, I'm fine if the rest are yellow triangles. And what you end up with here is it's very easy to create a very diverse and mixed up region. But when you up that percentage,
yeah, that's what you got here.
As soon as you say that, so let's look at the one on the right. I mean, this is still someone who says, I'm down with diversity. I just don't want to be the minority in my neighborhood. I would like to have, if there's 5 neighbors, I would like 3 of them to be like me and 2 not the other way around. If everyone feels that way, you end up with 0 diversity, complete and utter segregation, because there's no way to make everyone happy. And, on the left, even at 33%, if you say, if I have 6 neighbors, I just want 2 of them to be like me, there's no way to really do that without making people unhappy, to have everyone have that, you end up with total segregation. And this, of course, is then a metaphor for when we start saying, I don't mind if I'm a progressive, I don't mind if there's conservatives in my town, but I want it to be, there to be largely progressive. I want it to be a lot of progressives, at least half. You're going to have no conservatives in that town if everyone feels that way, because conservatives, if they feel the same way, are not going to want to move there. They're going to move to the conservative town. And suddenly, even though people are totally down with diversity, political diversity, it is complete segregation. Of course, this also applies to race and other ways you can be diverse or segregated.
And of course, this is where people pull out their lawn signs, and that only helps to extend the echo chambers. And eventually you have people who just don't want to live in the same country, right?
It's a self-perpetuating cycle, because what happens then is when you have a bunch of progressives all living together and a bunch of conservatives over there in the other town, again, even if most of these people are totally reasonable, they're not sure what they think about everything, and they're totally down to change their minds, and they like hanging out with people across the aisle, very quickly, this kind of psychology takes over, where and there's studies on this. I cite a couple in the book, where when you get a group of people together with their own kind, and you have them deliberate on a certain topic, so a bunch of people on the left are going to talk about hot political topics with each other, and a bunch of people on the right, what happens is the whole groups, they move farther apart. The left group becomes even more left, the right group becomes even more right. And when there's a lot of diversity, then people are open to diversity. They like it. It's a value. This can go to college or somewhere else. If there's enough, progressives and conservatives, and people like having both. As soon as it becomes over a certain amount and becomes pretty much all one side, it becomes very hostile to diversity. And suddenly now there's incentive to have more conformity, because if you have if you're a conservative professor at a university, and there's 25% of the university professors are conservatives, you're fine, right? People value diversity. There's plenty of other people. As soon as that percentage goes down to 10 or 5%, there becomes incredible hostility to those 10 or 5%. As the minority gets smaller and smaller, it becomes harder and harder to be it. So then what people keep their views to themselves, or they leave, more likely. So they'll leave the town, they'll leave the church, they'll leave the university, whatever it is. And so it's kind of there's a feedback loop that happens. Once this cycle starts, and this, by the way, look at America's political parties. They were totally overlapped in ideology and mixed up, and there were conservatives in the Democrats, and Republicans had lots of progressives. Once that starts to go like a trickle, it starts to move, suddenly it speeds up. And now you can't win an election if you're not, and before you know it, there's completely segregated by ideology.
This is a good place for me to bring in the fact that you also go into the history of like the Republican Party, which I found fascinating, because a lot of people have this hazy idea about what Republicans were like back in the 50s or 60s. And it's nothing like what most people think. Again, this idea that we have confirmation bias, or you have an inherent hostility inside you for whatever you perceive conservatives to be. And then you go into the left as well, and you talk about in great detail the evolution of postmodernism, of Marxism, of liberalism, and of what those things have given birth to. We talk about the word woke. I mean, you really go into the origins of lots of these things and talk about people who have become, for good or for bad, household names. People like, Robin DiAngelo or Larry Elder. And I think that this is a very, very useful text for people to go through in order to get an overall comprehension of what's happening in America right now, because it's all too easy. And you do also go into Trump, and you kind of go into Obama and all of that stuff. But that's almost the easy surface level stuff. It's too easy for people to just hop on the bandwagon with their preconceived notions and not to actually know the stories. I think that's really valuable.
I mean, the danger, if you do that, is if you're in your head, you're thinking, like, in the US, there's two teams. It's very unnuanced. There's the blue left-wing progressive Democrats, and then there's the red conservative Republicans. And if
Right.
in your head, for example, your mindset is blue good, red bad, right? And you're just locked into that.
Mm-hmm.
You now are hugely vulnerable to, if a new movement emerges that wears blue and says we are the champions of blue, and this is what the new blue is, and that's red and that's bad, and everyone who disagrees with us is red and that's bad, you're going to say, great, I'm on board because it's blue. But if that movement, if you're not critically assessing it, it might be completely contrary to why you liked blue in the first place. So I use the woke movement as an example here. As I'm someone who always voted left. I voted for Obama. I'm like all about liberal social justice, gay marriage, all of that, like so many people I know, we were all, that was very simple for me. It was like, clearly gay marriage.
You live in New York. If you lived in New York and you didn't think that way, you probably wouldn't have any friends.
Okay, well, it's just even conservatives in this country, the 60s civil rights movement, we're all about it now. Gay marriage, took a little while, but it's pretty popular, country nationwide now. Obviously, women's suffrage, if you go way back, every American is pro women's suffrage. Not every,
you get Republicans, even Republicans from the South, who are so, powerfully behind Martin Luther King now that it's kind of unfathomable based on the history of the South and where those people voted before.
If you're saying blue good, red bad, and you think Martin Luther King is great, right? He was classic blue, right? Social justice. And then you say, oh, I guess I'm woke now because that's what the cool blue people are doing. You just, without realizing it, are signing on to a movement that is the polar opposite of what Martin Luther King preached. The polar opposite. It's much more right-wing to me than it is. It's radical left, but it has a lot of, when you get really radical, you have a lot in common with really, really kind of regressive right-wing stuff. And so part of this book was, it's like, I wanted to try to steel man, again, we call it wokeness. That's kind of has baggage. So I don't even use that term. I call it social justice fundamentalism. And it's not even that I think it is necessarily pure bad. I think it is an ideology. I think it can teach us something. It's interesting. It's interesting to learn about. It's super left. It questions everything down to the foundations.
Take one, because again, I want people to read the book for themselves, but let's just take one subject, which comes up quite often and which I've encountered with friends of mine. I mean, real friends who are on the extreme left and who always show me this picture. And you can just talk us through this because you do this so well in the book. And I mean, give us a précis. You don't have to, go on in detail. You do in the book beautifully, but just give us an idea here of what's going on. So obviously, for people who are listening instead of looking, there are those three fans watching a football game, and they're all standing on boxes looking over the wooden fence, but the one person's very short. So it's called equality because they all have the same box to stand on. Then the next drawing is the same three people, but the tall guy doesn't have a box. The medium-sized person still has a box, and then the very short person has two boxes, and they call that equity. And then you've added a third picture, which sometimes they don't, of justice, where all three people are looking through a fence so that you don't need the wall at all.
So here, the wooden fence is supposed to represent like systemic institutional oppression.
Bias.
So not, the behavior of individuals, but that there's actually like, built-in structures that elevate certain groups and oppress other groups. And that's built into the fabric of the country. And so when you say there's equality of opportunity, everyone can go to public school, everyone can apply for a job, everyone can try to run for office, whatever it is, start a business. They're saying that doesn't do the job because the wooden fence is still there. So the second pane says, we need to actually use wooden boxes. The wooden boxes here represent something like affirmative action. We need to actually adjust give certain groups a springboard that other groups don't have in order to kind of account for the fence and mitigate the effects of the fence until the final day when eventually we have a society without this systemic oppression, and then then everyone can be on the same level ground and, succeeding equally, and everything's great.
That's cool. That's equity. And the last one, I mean, I said most of them don't include this one, but
that's the day when you finally have the wooden fence gone. That's justice, is when there is no need for affirmative action or something like that, because there's no more systemic inequality. There's just groups will naturally end up on the same playing field. Now, this is very much like one of the core bones of wokeness is this concept. Now, I believe in liberal social justice with lowercase l, liberal, like Martin Luther King, kind of classic liberal take on social justice, which says that liberalism is good. The house that we're all in here with that the Constitution is good. We haven't always lived up to its promises, and we need to do better. But that liberalism is good, and that free markets are good.
Free speech, free competition,
free speech, equality of opportunity, and treating people like individuals is good. Whatever. Liberal social justice is very big and broad, and it's open to all kinds of ideas. It's not a hardcore kind of ideology. So, as someone who believes in that, what I would say is I don't look at that meme and I reject it, say that's bullshit. Affirmative action is bad. I don't say that. I say, in the US, I mean, Black Americans, they're 5 generations away from slavery, and 2, or even in some cases 1, away from like Jim Crow laws, when there were, different actual, like an actual oppressed, like apartheid, situation. And even more recently, kind of bullshit laws like redlining and things that just have continued to kind of hold Black Americans back. People acquire generational wealth. And so like you get behind, once that starts to get behind, like it does create a long lasting effect. I'm fully on board with that. And I think that some level of I think that we should be doing something about that. Now, whether affirmative action is the best way or how much affirmative action, that's, I think, an open question we should be open to debating. I think that, there's all kinds of different potential causes here that would have like Black American income below white American income. But it's complicated, and we should have like very vigorous analytical discussions about it. We should be trying new things. We should be open to there should be nothing sacred. You should say this program is not actually good. That's how you solve problems. And you have to think about fairness. If affirmative action is coming at the expense of Asian Americans getting into Harvard, which is what it has been doing, like, okay, well, maybe that's not the way to do it if it's going to be totally unfair to another group. So this is nuanced and complicated and should be discussed like that. So my problem with the meme isn't that there's not times when a wooden box makes sense to elevate someone, and that there's not some level of wooden fence there for different groups in different ways. My argument is that it is really complicated, and it should be very open and very discussed. And there should be conservatives have their own views on this. They don't dismiss the idea of, that there's inequality and stuff. They just have totally different. They would say we need to emphasize 2-parent families in the Black community, which has gone from 75% of, Black children in the 60s grew up with 2 parents, and 25% today. So some like crazy number. They would talk about things. Great. Bring them into the room too. Let's have progressive views. My problem is that in wokeness, they say that if 2 groups don't have equal outcomes, they don't have the same income, they're not represented the same, there's only one reason that's happening, and it's 100% because of oppression and institutional racism. And the only fix for this, is stuff like affirmative action, like equity, box is actually doing double standards, or reverse discrimination. And so they say that this is exactly what's true. And if anyone here suggests any other solution or any other diagnosis of the problem, you're a racist and we're going to get you fired. The reason I'm saying it's the opposite of Martin Luther King is like, people on the left, what they ultimately care about is, stuff like improving the lives of Black Americans. If you take all the problem solving tools out of the room, silence all the discussion, and come up with this very unnuanced and very rigid kind of religious prescription for it, you're the worst enemy of progress in this case. All you're going to do is build a ton of racial resentment, and you're going to you're not going to solve any problems at all. That's not how grown-ups solve problems. So this is if you say blue good, right, red bad, and you're so attached to that, that's your identity. And now wokeness comes along, without realizing it, you're going to be fighting for, in my opinion, an ideology that halts progress for the things that you care about.
There are so many different parts of this book that hint at things that we also tend to gloss over. I mean, we throw around terms in society that have to do with what's going on politically, and maybe people who read this will find a lot of this stuff, oh well, that's kind of obvious, but it helps to be as well equipped as possible so that you can make sense of things, even if it's just so that when you hear people talking nonsense, you can kind of quietly inside smile or wince or whatever else it is and move on. Because at the moment, we're so stuck. And I think it's worse in America than it is even in South Africa. And we have our own history of racial problems and inequality and inequality of opportunity and plenty of other good stuff, which has made our history extraordinarily complicated. But somehow, I think America is at a place that is far more complex. For some reason, maybe because America has been this very evolved society for a long time, been at the world hedonism outlook. Maybe it's also the fact that increased polarization in America, and this is unavoidable under people like Donald Trump, has made it very, very difficult for people on more or less the same ethical or moral basis to have conversations that actually end up solving problems. Without going into too much else in the detail that we have done, have you passed this book around to friends of yours, and what sort of reaction have you got so far?
So I started writing this in 2016, long time ago, and and the way politics has changed and moved is ancient history. But I found that when I talked to, this was before Trump was even president, he was running at the time when I started this, and when I talked to my progressive friends, their reaction was usually something like, there's a legit like fascist that's about to be the president, like or things like he's doing this like Muslim ban and all this. How could you complain about anything going on the left? Do you think the left is the problem right now? And first of all, I was never saying the left is the problem. I was saying that there's a deep problem which is producing both kind of a woke mob and Donald Trump, and also flailing, misinformation around COVID and fueling, as I said, fueling conspiracy, all of this. This is one bigger problem, which is that we are as a society kind of in this downswing. But when I talked about that, the notion that anything that the problem was anything other than the right was just like inconceivable. Now, so I think if I had published this back then, I would have gotten a ton of pushback from people on the left, probably. And just partially because I have a lot more left readers than, I think hardcore Trump people would hate my message as well. I think conservatives who don't like Trump, just like it's progressives who favor Martin Luther King over wokeness, they love these ideas because they're, this is right in line with them. But the times changed in that, I think by 2018, 2019, I think that a lot of more people were fatigued with the culture wars and with mobs and with, cancellations and Trump himself, sick of him. And then but I still think it was slow and then we had George Floyd in the US and the protests, which then turned into riots, which then turned into people getting fired, which then turned into people overhauling the administrations of companies all across industries and rehire and hiring new people that were much more kind of into bringing wokeness into the workplace. And a lot of people, I think, started to say, okay, I think this is not such a good thing. This is, this has gone too far or whatever. And just as I just giving a few examples. I mean, there's stuff going on now with, transgender issues. Again, there's two convoluted things here. There's the liberal social justice person says trans people should be included and safe and accepted, and they should be able to. We should normalize this and understand it and all this. And then the woke person, goes much farther and says, that if you disagree with kind of our extreme views on this, you're transphobic and should be fired. Anyway, people have gotten sick of it. And so I noticed that when I came out with this book, it was 2023. most people I know, left and right, I think we're pretty open to this message. And so on one hand, I think, it could have made a bigger kind of splash earlier. It could have, maybe changed a bunch of minds. But it also would have run against a lot of minds that were not ready to be changed yet. I think today, I'm hoping it changes a lot of minds, but also I'm hoping that people who have kind of come around, like you're talking about, who feel like they're uncomfortable with the way things are going, and they feel like maybe like they're politically homeless a little bit. I want to tell those people, A, you're not alone. B, here are a bunch of ways to articulate what you may be feeling and to think about this through a framework that might help everything make sense. And C, encourage you to start speaking out, because you're not alone. And it's the silence of all these very reasonable, moderate people that I know. It's the silence that has allowed things to get this bad. So start speaking out, and you owe it to yourself to represent yourself correctly in the world. And if you're pretending to be something you're not, or you're even just silencing yourself, you're not doing yourself very much respect. You're letting fear of social consequences. No one's going to hang you. It's not the Maoists. You're not going to be beaten to death or executed. We're not in Nazi Germany. You're going to get some criticism.
And you may be surprised. You may be surprised to find out that you're actually in the majority once you start speaking.
Yes, you might be surprised to find how many people say, you know what, I've been thinking the same thing. I didn't realize anyone else thought this. So that's what I'm hoping for here.
Well, I love it. And Tim, you've done an absolutely terrific job here. I'm looking forward to deploying a lot of this in my conversations with people especially people who are afraid to voice their own opinion for fear that they'll be canceled, for fear that they'll be called names, for fear that all kinds of things will happen to them in society. And look, there are still very severe consequences for some people, particularly those who are not as independent maybe as you are or as I am. But I think the less we have to fear these conversations, and the more we start taking them out into the world and allowing other people to vent and to put their own thoughts out there in an articulate way, the better we'll all be at those high-rung thinking kinds of ways of doing things, rather than these low-rung ones, which are just making us detest each other, detest ourselves, and drag society down.
It's just a delusion, It's like if we're in this zone where we think like half of my country are evil and I hate them, like you've lost yourself. Like you've fallen into a tribal craze. And by the way, I'm not saying that this is something just other. I've done this. Like we've all felt this. It's like you've forgotten that people are three-dimensional and complicated, and issues are complicated, and that someone who disagrees with you, if you had their upbringing and you had their life experiences, you'd feel the same way. And maybe there's some stuff you don't know. Maybe there's some stuff that you're wrong about. Like if you're not thinking those things, like you've fallen into this low-rung thinking. It's like as I said, like I look at Nazi Germany, I'm like, how could human beings do that? It's like we have the capacity to slip into really bad modes that helped us survive 50,000 years ago, which is why we can slip into this mode. We all have this. And so to notice it and to just catch yourself and say, this is not real. Like there's not, there's not evil people everywhere. It's just not how it works. And that I'm not right about everything. It can go a long way. Have you noticed in South Africa, and these trends, I mean, are things getting, is your society getting like less mature, or is this just mine?
Look, I think we're certainly ordinary, average us in South Africa. We're starting to stand up for ourselves and speak out a lot more. We come from, because of apartheid, before South Africa was a free country, people really didn't have opinions about the government, because any opinion about the government would usually get you into trouble, and you had to be white to have an opinion about the government, and that was a real thing. I think what's happening post 1994 here is that in the beginning, everybody, including Black people, were afraid to challenge and criticize the new government, because they thought, well, this government has brought us freedom, so we should go along with whatever they do. And obviously that's changed an enormous amount in the last 10, maybe even 12 years, where people are now saying, and in the beginning, when I would speak out against them, it was always a question, oh, well, he must be racist. And now it's become much more, there are more people on my side when I criticize them, because there are obvious reasons that we should be skeptical in a healthy way about what government in this country has done. It's a lot more nuanced. It's a lot more varied. There isn't such consensus. There aren't these golems that you talk about that are moving across the landscape like they are in America. But that's not to say that we've solved any problems. I mean, we've still got a long way to go. And I think that's probably true for most countries in the world. But there is a general trend towards people being more authentic, people speaking their minds, people interrogating ideas, people not just bumping up against each other and calling each other names.
That's great. I mean, what you're describing there with if it's a situation when anyone who criticizes the government, the movement, the president, the ideology, whatever it is bad. What happens is there's now no mechanism there's no accountability for that entity. That entity now can do whatever they want.
Moustache that you talk about in your book.
The what?
That's King Moustache that you talk about in your book.
Exactly. If as soon as your people are too scared to criticize something, that thing now can get as bad and keep getting worse and worse and worse until people push back. So it's a much healthier, like what you're describing, is if people can detach criticism of this thing from being a good or bad person, but it's just a thinking person describing what they see. And there's not some evil motive behind it necessarily, right? Mm-hmm. That's huge. So I'm happy to hear that.
Well, I cannot recommend the book enough, so I will put it up on the screen again. It is called What's Our Problem? A Self-Help Book for Societies. It's by Tim Urban, and he has been our guest. Thank you so much, Tim. It's great to talk to you, and I know you're busy with another book. Are you going to give us some idea of what that's all about?
It's called, it's going to be about it starts at the Big Bang and it ends at the end of the universe. And I'm just going to basically try to tell.
Just a small, humble project then.
Yeah, it's the biggest zoom out possible on like what the hell is going on and where is this all going. But yeah, it's kind of it's a fun project.
Well, keep the blogs coming as well. I mean, a lot of us have been fans of all of that for a very long time. So thank you very much for the book. And I hope you have an awesome week. Thanks, man.
Thank you, Gareth. Thanks so much for having me on.
Great to see you. Tim Urban, everybody.